So guys, we're gonna talk about Moore's Law today. So, for those of you who don't know, Moore's Law was essentially this prediction in the
Oh, hold on.
1980s.
Breaking news.
Breaking
There was a
news.
trade accepted in our league.
Really?
I don't know how. So, Michael Fulmer got traded by a team that seemed to not be active. Uh,
What the? Wait, what the?
for
I.
Ian Desmond, Bud Norris, and Michael Waka.
Huh.
Interesting.
Ian Desmond DL,
Ian Desmond is
Bud
on the DL.
Norris. Yeah.
Bud Norris, who's
Uh,
arguably a top 10 relief pitcher this year.
then Michael
Michael Waka is
Walker.
inconsistent but very useful. All right, sorry, go ahead. I just saw that now.
Yeah, that breaking news. This just in. Um, yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Moore's Law was essentially this prediction in the 1980s that said that computers would get twice as fast about every year. And the reason this prediction was valid for really up until 2005, so about 30 years, was because we were able to make transistors on processors smaller and smaller for 30 years. So since the 1980s, computers did get twice as fast every year, but in 2005 we hit what was known as the power wall, which meant that um, post 2005 computers aren't really getting any faster. And if you look in the markets, for instance, processors are generally between like 2.5 and 3 gigahertz, for instance. And the reason is we can make transistors smaller like we did before, but now it's taking a lot more power. So it's infeasible, basically. So now because of that, researchers are looking to different ways to compute, essentially. So like right now we have silicon-based processors, and in the future we're looking towards computing such as DNA computing or proximate computing or quantum computing even. Um, so I'm planning on discussing parallel computing, which is the the phase we're at right now, proximate computing, DNA computing, and quantum computing. So once we hit the power wall in 2005, uh, processors were obviously not getting any faster. So the switch that companies like Intel and AMD went to first was parallel computing, which is essentially sticking multiple processors in a computer, in a sense. So that way you can run things not faster, but simultaneously. So if you've heard of things like a two core, like a dual core or a quad core processor, that just basically means that there are two or four processors in your computer. You could think of it that way at least. Um, and I mean, that's nice. Obviously, you can now run like two or four things at the same time, but it is still a temporary solution. So, and this isn't just my opinion, there are researchers at UC Berkeley um, with some very big names in the field like James Demel, David Patterson, Catherine Yellock. They were all saying that parallel computing is just a temporary solution right now because sure we can run two or four things, sometimes eight things at the same time, but a lot of times we don't have um, that many things to run at the same time. So there's no use to putting like two or four cores on your system if you're not able to use all of them. And then on top of that, there are problems that you can't really parallelize. Like there are some problems that if you throw more and more cores at it, you're not going to solve it any faster because you have to solve one step before you solve the next. So you can't do those two steps at the same time. So there's no use to having multiple cores. And then on top of that, parallel computing is also power intensive. Not as much as making transistors smaller, but it is still power intensive and it is still a temporary solution. So there's actually a group at Georgia Tech called Crunch, which is investigating new ways to compute. So some of the ways they've been discussing are things like approximate computing, DNA computing, brain-inspired computing, quantum computing. There's all sorts of different unconventional, unorthodox ways that we can build a computer. And there's a team of researchers all over the computing stack, from computer architecture to theory, who are working on determining which way is best and how to make that way practical. So one of the I guess straightforward solutions is known as approximate computing, which is kind of what it sounds like, in the sense that computers right now are very, very precise. Like, you can compute things to a high degree of precision, or like several significant figures is what I mean. But oftentimes that's not necessary. Like, that takes a lot of power, unnecessary power, and a lot of unnecessary compute time. So approximate computing is how can we build a processor, build gates like logic gates and algorithms that can solve a problem, not exactly, but just give an estimate. So approximation in general has been around for a while in the theoretical community. So approximation algorithms uh, have existed for a while, but no one's been looking at approximate computer architecture up until recently. And it's a pretty interesting field. Um, how can we design a processor that's not exact but approximate, but takes much less power and much less compute time, is an interesting problem that a lot of people are working on. At Georgia Tech, for instance, Hadi, I forget his last name, is someone who does work in approximate computing, for instance, if you want to look into his work. So that's approximate computing. And then there's also DNA computing, which is an interesting approach, since no one, or at least most people, don't think that we can compute with, you know, enzymes and stuff. DNA computing is essentially, it's also relatively what it sounds like. It's building a computer with DNA strands, enzymes, and all sorts of bio stuff. So the thing about DNA computing, so one question that a lot of people might come to mind, or a lot of people might have, is how does this work? Like, how can you store things on a computer or compute? So to compute on a DNA computer, researchers in 2013 actually invented a transcriptor, which is basically a transistor-like device, but instead of having silicon, it has DNA and RNA strands. And since we have this transistor-like device that we can build using DNA and RNA, that means that all sorts of logic gates, like AND gates, XOR gates, OR gates, they can all be made with DNA and RNA, And since we can make those logic gates with DNA, we can make a processor with DNA. So um, so in terms of capabilities, DNA computing isn't actually that much faster in terms of single core performance against a silicon chip. But remember what I said before, where a silicon chip, a silicon processor, you can give it multiple cores, but it'll still take like a fair amount of power. But with DNA computing, with a DNA processor, we could have like millions of cores and not take as much time, or as much power rather. So for problems that are very parallelizable, DNA computing seems to be, a pretty promising field. But obviously, or maybe not so obviously, DNA computing is still nascent. Like people were only able to solve some very relatively like trivial problems for a silicon computer on a DNA computer in like 2002 or something. So it's still nascent. And keep in mind the transcriptor was only invented in 2013. So it's obviously still a nascent field, but um, for problems that are very parallelizable, like matrix multiplication, for instance, this could be a very promising field. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about quantum computing, which is very buzzwordy in the field. And if you thought DNA computing was nascent, quantum computing is even more nascent. So the way quantum computing sort of works is on a silicon-based system, you might know that every single form of data on your computer, every single file or your browser, your homework, everything is stored in bits, which are either 0 or 1. So every single string of letters in your Word file is ultimately a string of ones and zeros to your computer. Now the thing about a quantum computer is, instead of having just ones and zeros, a quantum computer also has what's known as a qubit, which is essentially a superposition of 0 and 1 in this quantum state. And that allows quantum computers rather, to store more information and compute a lot faster than a silicon computer. Like, for instance, um, some of you may know that prime factorization on a silicon computer is very, very hard. And in fact, the reason it's hard, the reason it's hard is the reason that that cryptography really works. And by hard, I mean it's hard to do efficiently. But on a quantum computer, using an algorithm known as Shor's algorithm, this is actually pretty fast. So that building a quantum computer might lead to security concerns because a lot of public key cryptography relies on integer factorization being a very slow process, but on a quantum computer, it's really efficient. But again, quantum computing is also in a very nascent state. Um, Most of the work in quantum computation is very theoretical at the moment. One of the biggest researchers is Scott Aronson, who mostly does work in quantum complexity theory, which is essentially just a field of research that talks about what can quantum computers not do. So a lot of quantum computing research is still theoretical, and in fact, for instance, I mentioned that integer factorization is fast on a quantum computer, but we've only been able to factorize or factor the number 15 so far on an actual quantum computer. So there's still ways to go on a lot of these new ways to compute, but they're uh, very interesting, unorthodox forms of computation that we might see in the future, given the state of silicon processors and given the state of Moore's law. So, hope you enjoyed that interesting
All right, we're running long here, so
dialogue.
let's. I'm
Oh,
assuming
49
you've
minutes.
wrapped it up
Yeah, I think
effectively.
just to, effectively done. Yep.
We'll be back next week with hopefully a lot of fun things.
A lot of fun
Anything else you
things.
want to say?
Thank you,
All
viewers.
right, that's enough from you. Uh, we'll talk. We probably won't. I don't know. We won't have as much to talk about with baseball because of the All-Star break, but we will be here on Thursday, I assume, right?
I think so. Oh, happy belated 4th of July to all the Americans.
All right, no one cares. All right,
Hey,
so that's it.
America cares.
I'm going to just spend a little bit of time here. I mean, I'm going to start, although you can obviously weigh in. I'm going to talk about something that's been in the news a little bit if you follow kind of more scientific or technical news. So, if anybody has heard of the concept called the hyperloop, which is a concept for a high-speed, essentially rail system that some are planning to build, connecting major cities in the United States. So several different tech companies and startups have gotten in on this. Elon Musk has plans for it. So what's been in the news recently? There's a company called Hyperloop One, which operates out of San Francisco. They're planning to design a hyperloop system in the San Francisco Los Angeles area, which would cover the gap of about 350 miles. Recently, they did a full systems test of their prototype system, and it went through without a hitch. So that's a very good step towards ultimately having this technology for public use. So I know people probably don't know the specifications really. So the way these work is it's a vacuum tube, essentially a huge vacuum tube all the way between the one destination to the other, and then the cars are suspended by maglev technology. So essentially there's no resistance. You can propel them up to enormous speeds. What did I say the top speed was? 600 miles an hour or something?
Oh, I thought you said 250.
250 is what they are predicting for near future tests.
Oh, okay.
But for the San Francisco to LA one, they expect to eventually achieve speeds around 600 or more, 600 miles per hour. So to put that in context, that would let you travel between the two cities, which is over 300 miles in right around half an hour. Right? Did I do that?
Which is
Or it's 50 minutes?
300, yeah.
Something
300
like
miles an
that,
hour.
50 minutes.
300 miles, 600 miles an hour, so yeah, half an hour.
Sure, 50 minutes. Right? I'm mathing, right? Okay, it's short. It's really quick. Okay, it's really quick. It's just all told, it would take you a lot longer to fly a plane there. It's obviously not because of speed. It's because of all the other nonsense that goes on. So these things are going to work roughly like airports with several different tracks that will leave from terminals. They will be large passenger containers, so it's going to be highly efficient modes of transportation. And then also in the news, Elon Musk, as I mentioned earlier, is planning to design one in the New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, D.C. area. So basically, between those four cities, it's going to be a nice little system. A lot of people commute, obviously, in the New York and Philadelphia area. Really all of those cities. So that's going to be a huge boost to the commute time for a bunch of people, really. So he recently he got the go-ahead to start development. So we're looking for that pretty soon, a few years. So that's that. Hello.
Okay.
Anything to add?
No. I mean, I think that's everything.
They run on BASIC. Did you know that?
Run on basic.
Yeah, they run on BASIC. The
Like-
entire system, yeah, it's controlled by. I'm just trying to talk about CS. That's a lie, by the way. They don't.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
They don't. That would
Like,
not be good.
honestly, that seems so absurd that I thought you meant something else, like some sort of fuel that was called basic. I was like, there's no way.
Yeah, there is no way. Yeah. So anyway, that's all I have about that. Anything else? Haluk?
No. I mean, sounds like interesting technology that we might see in our lifetimes.
How about you, Daniel?
Oh, wait.
You have to do the impression again.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
He just says yeah.
That's something Daniel would say.
How about, okay, I think I can do this.
One word responses.
Yes. Yeah, so, yeah, the hyperloop is... it
I feel like
exists.
Daniel would like give a one
Man.
word response.
I mean, he would mostly just talk about Lost or something.
That's true, but I don't know anything about Lost.
Yeah. Daniel's editing this, so no ripping on him too much.
It's probably gonna edit it out.
That's what we do after the show is over. All right. Anyway, so we're pushing 50 minutes at this point, 40 minutes maybe. So yeah, it's time to cut this off.
All right. Well, thanks for watching, or thanks for listening.